Well, hello and welcome back to our Bible study today. I'm Reverend David Matthews, and I'm with my friend and colleague, the Reverend Nancy Springer. Today, we continue on through our conversation with Isaiah. We're looking at the third part of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 42, verses 17 through to the end of the chapter. We broke Isaiah 42 into three parts because we thought there was a lot of really good things there that we didn't want to miss. So we're going to continue on with that today. And Nancy, why don't you start us off with verse 17?
All right, I sure will. And just as a reminder, we are reading from the Common English Bible, and you are welcome to follow along in whatever version you have with you. Turned backward, utterly shamed are those who trust in idols, who say to a cast image, "You are our God." Hear, deaf ones and blind ones, look and see. Who is blind if not my servant, and deaf like my messenger whom I send? Who is blind like the restored one, blind like the servant of the Lord? You have seen many things, but don't keep watch. With ears open, you don't hear. The Lord desired for the sake of his righteousness to expand and glorify the instruction. But this is a people plundered and looted, everyone trapped in holes and hidden in dungeons. They have become plunder with no one to rescue, loot with no one to say, "Give it back."
Which of you will listen to this, will pay attention and respond from now on? Who gave Jacob to the looter and Israel to the plunderers? Wasn't it the Lord, the one we sinned against? They were not willing to walk in God's ways and wouldn't listen to his teaching. So God poured out on Jacob the heat of his anger and the fury of battle. It scorched him, and he didn't know it. It burned him, but he didn't give it much thought. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So Nancy, this is a pretty powerful section we've got here. And in it, right at the beginning, it seems to be a bit of a continuation from that first part of Isaiah. But is there, because it goes on about images and, who is the identity, if you will, or identifying who is God.
Right.
What would you highlight here?
Well, as you said, pointing back to the first bit of 42, right, where God says, "I don't hand out my glory to others or praise to idols." And so God reminds us, right, that when we are distracted, when we trust in other things besides God, right, we are backwards and we are utterly shamed because we've been told, we've been shown, we know who God is. And when we make the choice to let something else guide our way, then we are backwards and shamed, right? We are deaf. We intentionally turn our ears off and close our eyes to who God is, and then face the consequences of that.
Absolutely. And the recognition that when we do err, if you will, in identifying where our praise should be put, recognizing God's voice from the other multitude of voices out there, or even recognizing the path in which God's calling us to. Any one of these any of these errors, whether they're slight or huge, over an extended period of time or an extended distance, will create an enormously different result than what following God truly will be. And it's the idea of trying to navigate yourself by the stars or something like that. But if you've made a slight error in your calculations, then over a journey of days, months, years, you're going to end up in a very different location.
Yeah, exactly.
So this idea of trusting in idols, right, or other gods, God cannot let that stand, because if we were to follow those things, ultimately, even if we were to follow them a little over a long period of time, they lead to death. They don't lead to new life. And so that's why God is, of course, the attitude seems to be, God must correct these things, no matter how small.
Right. And it said that the Israelites, right, have taken blindness and deafness to a whole new level, because God has come back to them over and over again and said, I am the Lord your God, and this is how you must behave because of that. And they have not done so. And so, yeah, that intentional blindness, the choosing not to see, to say, God, I know that you've said this, but I'm going to ignore that, right? That's a whole different level.
Yeah, that idea of intentionally choosing, even though you've been shown multiple times, intentionally choosing something else is just crazy. And
Yeah.
but that's really why it's really the problem of sin, of course, is because if you know where the voice of God is, or love is, and you choose something differently, there is no real excuse for it.
No, and that's what sin is, right? Is choosing something else besides God, right? That we have missed that mark, to use the archery term, of aiming to be who God calls us to be and who we are created to be as the children of God. Right?
Absolutely.
So what we see right in the previous bit that we did of this chapter, right, where sometimes we interpret God's waiting, God's patience as slowness or abandonment, right? We also can interpret the natural consequences of our own choices as God being hateful and revengeful rather than the God who seeks justice, and the right form of vengeance, right? And so we have to, and that's part of intentionally closing our eyes to God, is we can blame God for the consequences of our own behavior instead of accepting the accountability of having intentionally ignored God.
Yeah, when we come to the results, if you will, of our own sin, the punishment, you can call it, the consequences, whatever you want to call it, when we come to them, we have one of a couple of different responses that are natural, right? We can either, we would like to be able to identify what went wrong and the cause of what went wrong, and then say, if I want to be right, if I don't want to have this thing happen to me again, I should change my behavior or change my thought or whatever it was that caused me to go wrong. That would be option A. Option B, of course, is to instead turn around and blame the one who's punishing you, or who you deem to be the consequence at the hand of, and blame that person. God, you're awful. I can't believe you would, ruin my fun. You're just mean or vindictive. Option B. Option C would, of course, be the idea of just not connecting the dots between what you are encountering and any of your previous behaviors at all, or God himself. And so we can get to a weird situation where people are either A, ignorant of God and continuing just to be ignorant of God, or B, just hating God for something that he's doing to try and help you, ultimately. And so that's a really messed up situation, but it's, as you pointed out earlier, it's often a chosen thing, because people, again, don't want the alternative.
Right, yeah. And that's what in the very last verse, right? So it says, God poured out on Jacob the heat of his anger and the fury of battle. It scorched him, but he didn't know it. It burned him, and he didn't give it much thought. So Jacob, a stand-in for all the leaders of Israel here, right, did not learn the lesson, learn the right way of following God, and just kept moving on ahead, right? They didn't stop to say, how can I grow and be better from this situation? They just kept marching in their own way.
Yeah, and it seems to connect to this statement made in the previous verse. They were not willing to walk in God's ways. And that being the point, though, the willingness. What's the famous line by Chesterton? The Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting. it's been seen difficult and left untried, right? And so it's the
Yeah.
sense of the people saw what it would actually take to walk in the ways of God. And whether it be because they thought they would be more profitable or prosperous living a different way, or whether they thought God's way cramped their fun, or, you know, who they wanted to be, all these different things, then yeah, absolutely, God nipped that one off. And the people don't want then to follow God. They're not willing to. And that's a hard thing. Yeah, that's a hard thing.
Well, and it goes all the way back, right, to the garden. And God gave Adam and Eve this abundance of everything they needed, right? You can eat of everything in the garden, everything. The variety and the abundance of it all, except for one thing. And what was the one thing Adam and Eve wanted, right? Was the one thing they could take for themselves rather than receiving God's gift of abundance.
Absolutely. And the story of Adam and Eve is a great one here, because as you just said, God highlighted or identified the sin. But Adam and Eve could have done anything else. Now, were those anything else good things? No, some of them might have been also really stupid. But God didn't identify those as sin. God didn't say, you know, if you do this, you are sinning or it's bad. And so consequently, there are a lot of things you and I can do that, you know, are stupid. And in doing so, we might hurt people around us. The consequences also might be bad for us. But in that sense, it doesn't necessarily break our relationship with God, perchance or perhaps. Now, again, God did say to us, love your neighbor as yourself. So if you are doing something that is hurting your neighbor, you know you are sinning. But equally, we can do things that are dumb, that don't destroy or damage our relationship with God. And in and through that, God, though, will gently guide us back to the truth and back to himself. Why? Because his love for us. And that's the thing about God, is he's always still making that way back to himself, right?
Yeah. And calling us to himself. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I note about this, is just that there is that, if you will, that sin of rebellion versus that sin of ignorance, or that mistake of ignorance, sin of ignorance. And in the ignorant part, God is not there ready to smack us one, it seems, but makes forgiveness and calling us back to him. But in the sin of rebellion, there seems to be much, and purposeful blindness or unwillingness, there seems to be a much greater consequence.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nancy, what have we missed here? What can we highlight?
I think that's all I've got.
Okay.
It's a good chapter. It's a full chapter. It took us 3 sessions to get through it. There's a lot there.
All right. Well, that's all I've got as well. So why don't we just end it here for today? And so, folks, God bless, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.